somewhere off the eastern edge of a continent that prides itself on permanence, a thin ribbon of sand refuses to hold still. It curls south from a point of open water, bends back on itself, and keeps moving. A few feet a year, sometimes a few feet in a single night, while the people who call it home go on building anyway. This is a place that exists in the same century as skyscrapers and interstates, yet answers to older forces, wind, current, and the slow arithmetic of erosion. Seen from above, it looks less like land than like a breath held between two bodies of water. On one side, the Atlantic Ocean pushes in with a restlessness that never fully quiets, wave after wave arriving from a fetch of thousands of miles. On the other, the Pamlico and Ocracoke and Albemarle sounds lie flatter, calmer, more forgiving, brackish, shallow, threaded with marsh grass that bends but does not break. Between them runs a spine of dunes no wider, in places, than a two-lane road, and often exactly that, a road, cracked and patched, with the ocean audible from the driver's seat. The ocean side is wild, unpredictable, capable of swallowing whole stretches of asphalt in a single storm tide. The sound side is gentle, a nursery of soft mud and seagrass, where children learn to paddle before they learn to swim in real surf. Villages sit wedged in the narrow space between these two temperaments, houses raised on pilings as if the ground itself cannot quite be trusted, because it cannot. But its true character lies not just in this fragile geography, but in the people who have chosen, generation after generation, to live directly on top of a slow-motion disappearance. Sand shifts, storms come, and still, families stay. This is the story of a coastline built on contradiction, land that is not fixed, communities that are. Modern satellite maps redraw these islands every few years, yet the surnames on the mailboxes have not changed in 2 centuries. Highways wash out in a single tide, yet the same families rebuild in the same footprint, sometimes the same week. This is a story not of a landscape conquering its people, but of people who have made an uneasy, enduring peace with a landscape that will not sit still. This is the story of North Carolina's Outer Banks. 100+ miles of barrier island strung between the mainland and the open Atlantic. And the story at its heart of what it means to build a permanent life on temporary ground. Before we dive in, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Leave your city and country in the comments below. Some villages along this coast count their year-round populations in the hundreds, not the thousands. Ocracoke, reachable only by ferry or small aircraft, holds fewer than 1,000 permanent residents. Rodanthe, Waves and Salvo together barely fill a single school gymnasium. In towns this size, anonymity is not an option, nor, most residents will say, is it wanted. A stranger's rental car is noticed within a block. A new face at the volunteer fire department's pancake breakfast draws friendly, unhurried questions before the first bite of syrup. Genealogies here run deep and tangled, surnames repeat across generations until half the phone book seems to belong to 2 or 3 extended families. the O'Neills and the Garishes and the Styrons of Ocracoke among them, names that appear on gravestones from the 1700s and on the roster of the current elementary school alike. This intimacy carries weight. A death in one household is felt within hours by the entire community. Casseroles arrive before condolences are even spoken aloud. A birth is celebrated the same way, informally, immediately, without needing to be announced. Privacy exists, but it exists differently than in a city, less about being unseen, more about trusting your neighbors not to make more of what they see than they should. Life on this coastline was never lived by people alone. Long before the first plank house went up on pilings, the islands belonged to creatures suited to a land that refuses to hold still. And in many ways, they still do. The wild horses of Corolla are the most visible of these residents, but far from the only ones. Along the marsh edges, great blue herons stand motionless until a strike into the water proves otherwise. Ospreys nest atop channel markers and utility poles, rebuilding the same stick nests year after year, diving for menhaden and mullet in a move locals watch the way they'd watch a good sunset. Brown pelicans glide in loose formation just above the waveline, riding air currents so precisely they rarely need to flap at all. Beneath the water, the story continues. The sounds serve as a nursery for blue crab, shrimp and juvenile flounder. The same shallow water that teaches children to paddle also raises the seafood that fills the coolers on the dock each morning. Bottlenose dolphins move through the inlets in small pods, sometimes trailing charter boats, sometimes visible from a porch at dusk. Sea turtles, mostly loggerheads, haul themselves onto the same beaches each summer to lay eggs, and volunteer turtle watch groups, largely retirees and teenagers, mark and guard the nests with the same devotion the islands apply to looking after their own. Not all the wildlife is beloved without complication. Feral hogs draw grumbling from property owners, and a growing deer population tests the patience of anyone with a garden. Mosquitoes, thick in the marsh air by early summer, are less a wildlife encounter than a rite of passage, endured with the same shrugging resilience applied to storms and washed-out roads. Autumn brings its own migration story. The sounds sit along the Atlantic flyway, and by late fall the shallows fill with tundra swans, snow geese, and a dozen species of duck, arriving in numbers that once supported market gunning and now support bird-watching tours. Waterfowl hunting, still practiced by some families, ties back to the island's decoy carving tradition, a skill kept alive as much by the birds' return each year as by the carvers themselves. What ties it together is the same fragile geography that shapes everything else here. The horses, the herons, the turtles, and the dolphins all depend on a shoreline that keeps moving, a marsh that keeps flooding and draining, a system offering no guarantees. Islanders who have spent a lifetime watching this wildlife arrive, nest, migrate, and sometimes vanish understand, perhaps better than anyone, that they are not the only ones making an uneasy peace with land that will not sit still. Before the tourist traffic wakes, before the beach umbrellas go up in neat rented rows, the villages keep an older schedule. Watermen are on the docks by first light, engines coughing to life in the grey hour before sunrise, coolers of ice sliding across weathered planks. The general store, and on these islands there, is usually just one that matters, opens early enough to catch them, coffee in styrofoam cups, a rack of fishing lures beside the register, a bulletin board thick with handwritten notices for boat slips, odd jobs, lost cats. Conversation at the counter moves in a familiar loop, how the fish are running, whether the wind will lay down by afternoon, whose roof still needs patching from the last storm. It is not small talk so much as a kind of civic accounting, a daily audit of the community's condition conducted one cup of coffee at a time. By mid-morning, the rhythm shifts. Charter boats push off from the marinas, trailing sport fishermen out toward the Gulf Stream. Contractors' trucks idle in driveways, ladders already unstrapped. Somewhere, without fail, someone is discussing the ferry schedule, arrivals, departures, the particular anxiety of catching the last boat off the island before dark. This daily choreography, unhurried but exact, is the true clock of these communities, keeping time not by hours, but by tide and task. For most of this coastline's history, the economy has been the water, full stop. Commercial fishing built these villages, trawlers dragging for shrimp and flounder, crab pots stacked in aluminum towers on every dock, oyster beds worked by hand in the shallow sounds. Menhaden boats once worked these waters by the hundreds, their catch rendered into fish oil and meal in mainland factories. Net making and net mending were, within living memory, a household skill as ordinary as sewing. Boat building grew up alongside fishing, and it still survives in small workshops where wooden skiffs are shaped by hand, plank by plank, using techniques passed down with almost no alteration since the 19th century. Waterfowl hunting supplied both food and income, giving rise to the decoy carving tradition that survives today as much as art as necessity. This was never an easy living. Weather could erase a season's income in a single bad week. Regulation, market prices, and dwindling fish stocks have squeezed commercial fishermen harder every decade. But it built a working culture defined by self-reliance, mechanical competence, and an unsentimental respect for the water that provided, and occasionally took. Modern tourism now surrounds these islands so completely that it is easy to mistake the whole coastline for a resort. Millions of visitors arrive each summer, filling vacation rentals that line the dunes in tight rows, keeping restaurants, surf shops, and real estate offices in year-round business. Highway 12 south of Nag's Head is now flanked, for long stretches, by the very industry that has quietly displaced much of the old working economy. And yet a working core holds itself apart, deliberately, from the tourist tide. Commercial docks still operate a short walk from souvenir shops, their boats slipping out before dawn and returning after the beachgoers have gone in for the day, the two economies passing each other in near silence. Long-time families continue fishing not because it remains the most profitable option. Often, it plainly is not, but because it is understood as a birthright and an identity, something to be defended rather than abandoned for easier money. The tension is visible everywhere, a for sale sign on a decades-old family fish house standing beside a newly built rental mansion. A captain explaining to a summer visitor, patiently, for perhaps the 1000th time, why the fish are running late this year. Modernity has arrived. It has not entirely been let in. To move through this landscape on foot is to pass through several distinct worlds within a single mile. The ocean side offers open dunes, sea oats bending in constant wind, sand scoured smooth by tide and storm. Underfoot, it shifts from packed and walkable near the waterline to soft and slow, going higher up the beach, where dune grass roots hold just enough sand together to keep the whole system from blowing away entirely. Cross the narrow spine of the island, and the terrain changes abruptly. Maritime forests, stands of live oak and loblolly pine, wind sculpted into low, sideways leaning canopies, offer sudden shade and a hush that feels almost indoor after the open beach. Spanish moss hangs from branches, the ground smells of damp leaf litter and salt, an unlikely combination found nowhere but here. Closer to the sound, marsh takes over. Cordgrass standing in brackish shallows, fiddler crabs skittering sideways at the first footstep, the mud pulling at boots with a soft, insistent suction. Herons stand motionless in the shallows. Ospreys circle overhead, diving occasionally with a splash audible from shore. At Jockey's Ridge, the largest living sand dune system on the eastern seaboard rises unexpectedly from flat terrain, its ridgeline shifting year to year, climbed by children and hang-gliding tourists alike, a monument to the same restlessness that defines the whole coastline. Every small community draws a line somewhere between who belongs and who is merely visiting, and here the line has its own vocabulary. Long-time families call themselves born-heres, a designation that can trace back 6 or 7 generations without much effort. Newer arrivals, retirees, remote workers, second home owners who eventually stay year-round are, more gently than it sounds, called come-heres. The affectionately blunter term for a tourist who wanders too far from the marked path is a dingbatter, used with a smile more often than a scowl, but a distinction all the same. The dynamic is not hostile so much as watchful. A come-here who spends a decade volunteering at the fire department, learning the tide charts, and showing up at every oyster roast can eventually be granted something like provisional belonging, though rarely, if ever, full-born here status. Long-time residents speak of watching the population turn over slowly as fishing families sell waterfront lots they can no longer afford to hold, and out-of-state buyers arrive with renovation plans and unfamiliar accents. Winter reveals the truth of this arithmetic most clearly. The summer population of some villages swells to 10 or 20 times its off-season size, then empties again by October, leaving streets that were bumper to bumper in July eerily quiet by Thanksgiving, the born-heres reclaiming, briefly each year, a version of the island that used to be theirs alone. Getting anywhere on these islands has never been simple, and the infrastructure reflects it. A single road, Highway 12, threads the length of Hatteras Island, running so close to the ocean in places that storm tides regularly wash straight across it, burying lanes in sand that road crews must bulldoze clear before traffic can resume. Locals track its condition the way city commuters track subway delays, checking transportation department updates before any drive longer than an errand to the store. Where the road ends, the ferry begins. State-run boats connect Hatteras to Ocracoke on a schedule as fixed and as trusted as gospel, carrying cars, trucks, delivery vans, and the occasional coffin in equal, unremarkable stride. Missing the last ferry of the evening is not a minor inconvenience. It can mean sleeping in a parked car or scrambling for last-minute lodging on the wrong side of the Sound. Air travel supplements this fragile network for those who can afford it. Small planes landing on short island airstrips, but for most residents and nearly all commercial fishermen, the ferry and the road remain the only lifeline connecting a scattering of villages to the mainland and to each other, a modern transportation system built, paradoxically, on infrastructure as impermanent as the sand it crosses. Above the shifting road and the uncertain ferry schedules, a handful of fixed points still hold their ground, or at least appear to. The black and white spiral of the Cape Hatteras lighthouse, the tallest brick lighthouse in the country, has warned ships off these shoals since the years before the Civil War, its beam sweeping the same stretch of dangerous water for well over a century. Nearby, the Body Island lighthouse rises striped in black and white horizontal bands, and further north, the red brick Ocracoke Beach lighthouse stands unpainted, left bare so sailors could tell the three towers apart by daylight alone. Even these monuments have not been exempt from the island's basic instability. By the late 20th century, erosion had crept close enough to the Cape Hatteras lighthouse's foundation that engineers made the extraordinary decision. In 1999, to move the entire £9 million structure inland on a system of steel rails and hydraulic jacks, relocating it more than half a mile from the spot where it had stood since 1870. Residents watched it happen in slow motion, brick by brick, foot by foot, over the course of about 3 weeks. A lighthouse built to be a fixed point, proven, in the end, to be just as much at the mercy of the sand as everything else. Lighthouse keepers are gone now, replaced by automated lamps and park service caretakers, but the towers remain a kind of shared compass for the communities beneath them. Landmarks children are taught to recognize before they can read a map. Silhouettes painted on water towers and welcome signs, the one constant image visitors and islanders alike agree belongs, unmistakably, to this coastline. Beneath the rhythm of daily life sits a harder set of questions, and residents rarely pretend otherwise. Sea levels along this coast are rising measurably year over year. The same storms that have always tested these islands now arrive against a slowly climbing baseline of water, making each hurricane season's damage marginally worse than the last. Beaches' nourishment projects, trucking or pumping sand back onto eroding shorelines, buy time at enormous public expense without solving the underlying math. Economic pressure compounds the environmental one. Rising property values, driven by tourism and vacation home demand, have pushed housing costs beyond what many working fishing families can afford, forcing a slow generational attrition away from the very trades that built these communities. Commercial fishing itself faces tightening regulation, shifting fish stocks, and a labour pool aging faster than it replenishes. And there is the harder question beneath all the others. One residents ask themselves more than they ask visitors: how much longer can a barrier island, by definition temporary, be expected to support permanent human life? Engineers debate managed retreat. Homeowners debate raising their houses yet again. No one debates leaving. Not seriously, not yet. But the question sits quietly at every town meeting, unresolved, the way it has for decades. They stay for the water, for docks at dawn, for a horizon that never quite looks the same way twice, for a livelihood pulled directly from something larger than themselves. They stay for each other, for casseroles that arrive before condolences, for chainsaws that appear before the wind has fully died, for a community too small and too entangled to let anyone fall through unnoticed. And above all, they stay for the particular, irreplaceable feeling of belonging to a place that belongs, however briefly, to no one. A strip of moving sand that answers to tide and storm rather than deed or title. And that has, against every reasonable expectation, held a people together for centuries. The ocean will keep pushing. The sound will keep its gentler, patient claim on the other side. Somewhere between the two, the road will wash out again, and again it will be cleared. The brogue will fade a little further with each passing decade, and somewhere a grandmother will keep speaking it anyway, quietly, to a grandchild who may be the last to hear it firsthand. What remains, through all of it, is not permanence. This coastline promises none, but rhythm, tide and labor, storm and repair, leaving and returning. Repeated so long and so faithfully that it has become, itself, a kind of shoreline the water cannot take.